This is a horror story, one of the most frightening in history. In September 1918, Camp Devens, Massachusetts. The man on the autopsy table has turned blue. Dr. William H. Welch nods to proceed. His colleagues reach for the bone saw and begin to open the rib cage. The man's lungs are heavy. Welch and his colleagues lean in as they're opened. The lungs are so full of fluid that it's traveled up the trachea. The man had drowned in his own body, just like the others. Welch needs air. He opens the door and stumbles around men lying on the floor. There are no longer enough beds in the hospital. 6,000 men crammed in a facility meant for 1,200, and they're turning blue. In 1918, a new disease emerged. We still don't know exactly how or where it first began infecting humans, but within months, it would spread across the planet, from the trenches of the Western Front to the most remote villages on Earth. It infected a third of the world's population and killed between 50 and 100 million people. To put that in perspective, the low estimate would make it twice as deadly as World War I, while the high estimate would mean it killed more than both world wars combined. Between 3 and 6% of the global population died within 18 months. It was the first modern plague, turning our interconnected world against us by spreading through shipping lanes, rail lines, and the arteries of industrialized war. Yet it was also the first pandemic of the scientific age, where doctors could, to some extent, understand what was happening and stand against the infection, though they lacked the tools to stop it. So in 1918, while researchers couldn't really see viruses, they knew such things must exist. They had no idea that, unlike the bacteria they could see in their microscopes, flu was not alive in any way humans understood it. Just a bunch of unstable genetic material that possessed a cell, forcing it to pump out billions of copies of itself. And with each cell infected, a minority of those new viruses mutated into something more infectious, more deadly. And when the nightmare ended, the world did what any person does when they wake from a dream. It forgot. But forgetting is something we can't afford, because the virus that ravaged the world in 1918 is still out there, still mutating, and it will return. Yet, despite its impacts, we still don't know where the pandemic originated. But there are theories. Canada, 1917. A train races across the plains. Military guards are instructed to keep civilians away from the locomotive. If they see what's inside, there may be a riot. These cars, designed for cattle, contain the men of the Chinese Labor Corps. Here they are, shipped to Canada, crammed on train cars, and traveling overland to a troop ship in Halifax. But there's something else among them. A respiratory disease that had ravaged northern China the previous year. A winter sickness severe enough that some victims coughed blood and turned blue. First, one recruit begins to cough, then another. One by one, they fall ill with splitting headaches and chills. Crammed into the cattle cars, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to isolate the sick. They beg the guards to let them get off and seek medical attention. But due to the rampant anti-Chinese sentiment in Canada, the guards have their orders to keep the passengers a secret. By the time they reach Halifax, 3,000 have to be placed in quarantine. Doctors give the sick nothing but castor oil for sore throats and load the rest of the recruits onto the troop ships for France. Those men aren't sick. Yet. Because another emergence is about to occur in the unlikeliest of places. March 4th, 1918. Camp Funston, Kansas. Like every military base in America, Camp Funston is overcrowded. The second largest training center in the country, Funston's 56,000 men live in barracks and tents, each waiting to be rotated to duty in the US or France. Diseases always break out when recruits muster for war, so it's no surprise when a private, a cook no less, reports for sick call with influenza. By noon, 107 other soldiers have joined him. Within 3 weeks, it'll be over 1,100. A month before, and 300 miles away, the lone doctor in Haskell County, Kansas, had watched flu kill dozens of his strongest, healthiest patients. Its rapid pace and high fatality rate alarmed him so much that he contacted the Public Health Service and published an alert in the National Health Journal, but no one listened. The paper's obituary page was unusually busy that February, but weeks after the first case at Funston, 10% of recruits were reporting sick at 2 camps in Georgia. By the end of the month, 24 of the 36 largest military bases in America had cases, along with 30 major cities. No one noticed. Yet. Army Medical Department, Washington, D.C. Dr. William H. Welch was tracking an epidemic. One of the country's most famous doctors, Welch had helped drag American medicine into the modern age. He helped found the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, spread the use of microscopes, and organized the Rockefeller Institute, the country's first dedicated medical laboratory. His work had helped transform America from a nation of country doctors to a titan of scientific medicine, able to compete with the Pasteur Institute in France and the Koch Institute in Berlin. Because of him, America had joined the age of the microscope and the vaccine. A bright world where doctors could both see diseases and kill them. The last few decades had brought vaccines for smallpox, rabies, anthrax, diphtheria, and meningitis. They'd all warned the army that this would happen if they overcrowded the camps. But no one listened. Welch had dispatched an experimental vaccine that fought one form of bacterial pneumonia, as well as a serum that cut the death rates by half. Results of the test looked good, if not 100% effective. It was proving a successful response. But there was a problem. Because the epidemic that Welch was fighting to contain wasn't flu. It was measles. In April, it erupted among the American troops at their disembarkation ground in Brest. By April 10th, the first cases began showing up in the French army, which generally trained and served alongside American units. It was hard to notice at first. High fever, headache, and weakness could come from many diseases that swirled around the trenches, such as insect-borne trench fever or typhus. But it soon became clear that this was different. The troops called it three-day fever, knock-me-down fever, or la grippe. It rarely killed, but men who got it were out of action for days and lead-footed for weeks. The overcrowded camps and trenches of the Western Front were ideal tinder for an epidemic. Men lived within inches of each other, their immune systems compromised from exhaustion and disease. And unlike a city where the virus might run out of victims, here, fresh bodies were rotated onto the line every few days. It spread to the British in early May, and by then, there was no hope of containment. It swept through them like a bad spirit. English hospitals saw over 36,000 admissions for flu in a single month. Only then, when it began undermining the troops' ability to fight, did military doctors raise the alarm. The outbreak had sprung up during a critical phase of the war. The Germans had launched a massive spring offensive, and Allied generals needed every man possible on the line. But as spring turned to summer, the frontline hospitals of the Allies swelled to overcapacity. Men on the front lines would get ready to rotate to the rear, only to find that the unit ordered to relieve them had instead gone into quarantine. Medical tents had run out of space, and some hospitals took to laying patients outside on canvas tarps. In late May, a group of French recruits came down with it. 69% of them had to be hospitalized, and 5% died. By the end of the summer, 10% of the British Army had fallen ill. Back in Washington, D.C., Welch and his epidemiologists finally took notice. The flu, previously ignored, became a matter of national security. They set about turning the Rockefeller Institute into an information gathering and communications center for the disease. Welch wanted anything he could get his hands on: reports, lung samples, information on treatment, so he dispatched doctors to centers of infection to swab throats and collect samples. But all of it remained a closely guarded secret. No one wanted the Central Powers to know that the Allies were being weakened by disease. Upon entering the war, both the US and Britain had clamped down on the press with unprecedented censorship measures. When American officers denied or minimized reports of the flu, newspapers at home accepted it without question. The British, for their part, tried to strangle any mention of the spreading plague. But with the virus now infecting the civilian population, news of an epidemic started to leak. In May, the virus arrived in Madrid, and since Spain was neutral, it wasn't subject to wartime censorship. There, the flu made front-page news, especially once it infected the king. It whipped through Spanish cities, passing from person to person so fast that local wits named it after a hit opera song, The Naples Soldier. It was as catchy as the song, the joke went, if more deadly. International newspapers picked up the story on the Madrid outbreak and, erroneously, assumed the disease had originated there. And from those articles, the killer gained another name, the Spanish flu. But it wasn't just the Allies covering up the flu's impact. On the other side of no man's land, the German commander, General Ludendorff, was also wrestling with the disease. Ludendorff had gained day-to-day command of the German military in 1916, along with a huge amount of political power, and he'd used it to embark on a bold plan to save the Kaiser and Germany. The next phase of the operation was critical. But as he began to organize for a final push, his generals requested a delay. The German army, you see, had the flu. They'd caught it in June, probably from a British prisoner of war, and by July it was sweeping the ranks. German troops, their systems already weak from food rationing, appeared especially susceptible to infection. 500,000 soldiers were sick. In some units, a quarter of the men were too ill to fight. But German accounts do suggest the flu bled the army's manpower and resolve at a critical moment. And just as it had tipped the balance, it was gone. In August, British hospitalizations fell to the point that they had declared the epidemic over. But it wasn't over. For as the balance of the war was shifting, so were the virus's genes. Even today, no one's sure what happened. Perhaps the original, deadly virus had temporarily mutated into a mild strain, only to have its lethality re-emerge. Or it may have infected someone, even an animal, that had a different version of the flu and the two viruses combined. It's even possible that, as it passed through millions of soldiers, this avian virus was gradually adapting itself to human hosts. 1 month later. Brakes squeal, steam vents. Dr. Welch and his team are pulling into a train station in Washington, D.C., returning from a grueling cross-country inspection of military hospitals. They hope to make their report and get some rest. Instead, a soldier meets them on the platform with new orders. Proceed immediately to Devens. Spanish influenza has struck the camp. Live in Massachusetts. They find Camp Devens paralyzed. Patients fill each inch of hospital space, turning blue and coughing so hard they tear their abdominal muscles. They hemorrhage blood from their noses and scream in fevered delirium. In extreme cases, the disease has ripped tiny holes in their lungs. Oxygen leaks out, collecting beneath the victim's skin, so they crackle when nurses roll them over. Like the pop-snap sound of rice cereal. What is happening? All training has stopped. Recruits that aren't sick have been put into service caring for those that are. Nearly half the camp's medical staff is ill. Some didn't even show symptoms, they just collapsed. These sudden onset patients often die within 12 hours. Those that avoid that quick death are falling to secondary pneumonia infections. The Army has arranged special trains to take away the dead, and it's already showing up in Boston. After a marathon session of autopsies revealing lungs full of frothy blood, the team turns to Welch. He's the head of the American Medical Association and has studied rare diseases on 3 continents. Shaken, Welch says, "This must be some kind of new infection or plague." Then he runs out of the room, stepping around sick men to get to a phone. He calls his boss, Army Surgeon General Gorgas. "This is going to spread," he says. The Army needs to shut down troop movements and expand hospital space now. Then, he calls the Rockefeller Institute and orders Dr. Oswald Avery to report to Devens. Avery is a peculiar man. Like Welch, he'd shown no interest in marriage or family, but unlike Welch, who schmoozed at private clubs and vacationed in Atlantic City, Avery had no hobbies or social life. He is a single-minded obsessive who lives in an apartment next to the Institute and talks only about his work. If anybody could find the pathogen responsible, Avery could. But they have so little time. Several things need to happen, Welch reasons. They need to figure out how the disease spreads and how to kill it, and whether they could do anything to stop it. They need to identify the pathogen, the bacteria or toxin that caused this disease, so they could develop a serum, antitoxin, or vaccine. And that was Avery's task. Avery, who had done such good work on the pneumonia serum they'd tested in the summer, which might come in handy given all the secondary pneumonia cases. But Welch and his team weren't the only ones hunting for the pathogen. Long Island, New York. The speeding Board of Health car fishtails down the dirt road. Inside it sits the most unusual pair in American medicine. In the passenger seat, hanging on for dear life, is Dr. William Park. Behind the wheel, with her foot firmly on the accelerator, is the lab's assistant director, Dr. Anna Williams. The two seem almost polar opposites. Where Park is religious, Williams doubts. He's a gentleman born to high society, where she prefers driving fast cars and riding shotgun on stunt planes. But in 25 years of collaboration, they've won fame for their work on polio, rabies, and diphtheria. Which is why they're speeding towards an army base. If American doctors hope to produce a vaccine or serum to fight this new disease, they need Park and Williams. Meanwhile, Army epidemiologists are tracking the spread of the disease. They could actually chart it on a map, jumping from base to base along shipping routes and rail lines. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans, Puget Sound, the Great Lakes. Sometimes men became so sick in transit that they had to be carried off the ships and trains when they reached their destinations. Their initial investigation suggests it's severe influenza. That means it's airborne and can survive for hours on hard surfaces. The large number of secondary infections indicate that it suppresses the immune system. Surgeon General Gorgas tries to raise the alarm. He insists his superiors freeze all transfers and stop the troop ships. At the very least, they could hold the men in quarantine for a week before they board. The military refuses. Germany is on their last legs, they argue. The Austrians and the Ottomans are rumored to be drafting peace offers. This is not the time to let up the pressure. Nothing must distract them or the public from the war effort. They send out the next draft registration, forcing thousands of men across the country to crowd into civic buildings to fill out paperwork. Gorgas protests. What is the point of this? The camps have stopped all training to deal with the outbreak. These new draftees wouldn't become fighting men. They'd just report for duty and get flu. Finally, a win. The army agrees and cancels the next draft. But it's too late. As Gorgas battles the generals, unit commanders are already ignoring medical advice. At Camp Grant, a doctor sits in the commandant's office telling his commander that the overcrowding situation is dangerous. He's ignoring regulations. Too many men in the barracks and on transfer trains. The commandant's answer will seal his fate. In 2 weeks, the doctor will be back in this office, telling him that 500 men are dead. The last troop train they'd sent had turned into a plague train. A quarter of the transfers had to be hospitalized, and the camp had run out of coffins. November 28th, Philadelphia. The Liberty Loan Parade is in full swing. Thousands march in the streets. Hundreds of thousands watch. Few know that health officials have pressured the mayor to cancel the event. Women wave flags. A child sits on his father's shoulders. The crowd falls silent for a simulated bombing run. Airplanes buzz overhead. Anti-aircraft guns fire blanks into the sky. The crowd, necks craned, tries to imagine what it's like to be in mortal peril. Little do they know, they already are. The flu was already burning in Philadelphia, but after the Liberty Loan Parade, it explodes. 3 days later, the hospitals start to fill. With the war sapping medical professionals, there aren't enough doctors or nurses, and the hospital staff starts to die. Though colleagues fall around them, doctors and nurses stay at their posts. Some in private practice make 60 house calls a day. Over 1,000 die that first week, and in 3 weeks, the death toll approaches 5,000. The dead quickly begin to overwhelm Philadelphia. Morticians post staff at hospitals to free up beds the moment victims expire. If a patient starts turning blue, nurses tag them for the morgue. It saves time. But the morgue is out of space and refuses to accept more bodies. Workers keep doors and windows open to dissipate the stench, and fluid runs out the door and into the gutter. The Catholic Church gets involved, mobilizing clergy to help clear the backlog. When the priests enter the morgue, they find 400 bodies. They're everywhere. Lying on desks and stacked in corners, the building is at 12 times its maximum capacity. Things are no better at graveyards. Pre-burial vaults are full. The city has run out of coffins and wood to build coffins. People use wheelbarrows and potato sacks to bring loved ones to the cemetery, then leave them there. Once again, the church steps in, hiring a construction crew to dig trenches with steam shovels. They stack the coffins 2 deep while recording exactly where each person is buried. At night, citizens hear them reciting Latin prayers over the mass grave. But that took time to organize. And for weeks, thousands are not buried at all. With hospitals, morgues, and cemeteries refusing to accept corpses, people have to live with the dead in their homes. And many families are so ill that they can't move a corpse at all, and simply sleep, eat, and live next to the deceased. Weeks in, Philadelphia leaders finally rent a warehouse as an overflow morgue. Organized teams of policemen and priests circle the city, collecting the dead in horse-drawn carts. Philadelphia would be the worst-hit city in America, with 500,000 cases. By the end of October, the city government almost ceased to function, and private citizens stepped in to run the response. People volunteered cars as ambulances and worked as dispatchers at medical phone banks, a primitive 911. But just up the coast, it was a different story. While the head of New York's Board of Health had been slow to respond, the city had experience fighting epidemics like polio and tuberculosis. The Public Health Service had a major presence and experience screening and quarantining people at the Port of New York. In fact, the port had started quarantining ships the moment reports of the flu arose on the Western Front. But the war made full quarantine impossible. The city instituted laws criminalizing spitters and people who failed to cover their mouths when they coughed or sneezed. They posted notices urging the sick to stay home under voluntary quarantine, report illnesses to a doctor, and they called for people to wear gauze masks. The Board of Health surveyed neighborhoods to track the spread. They set up medical centers that dispatched doctors and nurses on house calls. And most importantly, they convinced businesses to stagger working hours and shopping times, reducing crowds on public transit. But even in New York, the press continued to minimize the outbreak in order to protect morale. And it was the same in cities and towns across America, even as the disease spread west. Newspapers would claim there was nothing to worry about one day, and then the next announced that all public gathering places were closed. The result was uncertainty and fear. Everyone knew newspapers were covering it up. People could see the obituaries. They saw the Red Cross ads begging for nurses. Families tracked the flu coming down the rail line or highway via letters and articles buried in the back pages. It was in the next state, the next county, the next town, and finally next door. In this climate of mistrust, rumors grew. One conspiracy theory claimed the flu was a bioweapon released from German U-boats off the Atlantic coast. Another said that the German-owned Bayer Corporation had poisoned its aspirin with the disease. A rumor ran around Phoenix that dogs carried the disease, and as a result, Arizonians killed thousands of strays and pets. And in San Francisco, a policeman shot a man who refused to comply with new flu mask laws. Evangelist Billy Sunday claimed the disease was a punishment visited upon a sinful nation and held a mass prayer meeting to end the epidemic. Several in the crowd collapsed of flu while praying for deliverance. Whole towns isolated themselves, hiring armed guards. The flu got in anyway, arriving with mailmen and milk trucks. Shops began asking customers to shout their orders, then leave the money on the doorstep. The owner would take the money and leave the goods. Children distilled this paranoia into a jump rope rhyme, one that captured the sense of an unwanted visitor invading the home.
I had a little bird and her name was Enza. I opened up the window and influenza.
The country needs something to stop this nightmare. At the Rockefeller Institute, they isolate Pfeiffer's bacillus in mid-October, and the Army Medical School begins the process of injecting it into horses, drawing their blood, and isolating the antibodies for a vaccine. By October 25th, the vaccine is ready. Express trains rush deliveries to the West Coast to protect troops and shipbuilders there. They've made enough to vaccinate the entire U.S. Army and its civilian employees, but only enough for the Army. For the duration of the war, the Rockefeller Institute was a military organization, and therefore their work focused on the military. No matter how much mayors and governors begged for vaccine, they wouldn't receive a single vial. It took a parallel civilian effort to provide relief to the public. At the New York Hygienic Lab, Williams labors over lung samples from hospitals and orphanages, trying to find whether Pfeiffer's exists in a majority of victims. And she finds it. Everywhere. She isolates a sample and proves antibodies can bind to it, further confirming it was the culprit. That done, she cultures vast quantities of Pfeiffer's, liter upon liter, then hands them off to Park, who rushes upstate to mass-produce vaccine at his farm. Deep down, researchers knew this was not good science. The process had been too fast. No one really knew whether Pfeiffer's caused the flu, and if, as some suspected, the culprit was a virus invisible to microscopes, these vaccines would do nothing. It was, one researcher said, like fighting a ghost. Still, it was worth trying. There was a possibility they'd accidentally snare the disease-causing agent in their sample, and the horses would make antibodies for it. That was how the first rabies vaccine happened, after all. In fact, one Rockefeller researcher counted on this, producing a vaccine that contained antibodies for every bacteria he could find, all mixed together, hoping that one would stop the disease. Even as they rolled out the vaccine, Surgeon General Gorgas cautioned it was experimental, and no one knew if it would work. And it didn't. Labs across the country produced dozens of vaccines, and none of them prevented flu. Because flu was, as some feared, an invisible virus. Yet despite that failure, medical science was not helpless. They could do little for patients killed directly by the flu, the ones that turned blue, but they could fight the opportunistic pneumonias that followed it. The anti-pneumonia vaccine in serum Avery had worked on during the earlier measles epidemic was effective, and likely saved some people. Thousands of troops took it. On the surgical side, doctors developed a new procedure to enter the lungs and drain the sacs of pus that drowned patients. Others used oxygen, x-rays, and cardiac stimulants to support ailing victims. But nurses provided the most valuable care. There were too few doctors, too many patients, not enough medicine, and what treatments they had often took too long to administer en masse. Nurses, on the other hand, could keep patients hydrated, warm, and breathing comfortably. They could ease coughs and lower temperatures. And that kind of long-term care probably affected a patient's survival more than anything a doctor could do in the few minutes they had at each bedside. Added to that, the Red Cross developed a system that predicted the flu's cycle of infection, when it would die down in one area and spring up in another, letting them deploy emergency teams of nurses before they were needed. But as everyone from city officials and the Red Cross responded to the crisis, there was one man who refused to do anything: President Wilson. When briefed about the deadly influenza outbreak, the one question on his mind was whether he should order the troop ships to continue ferrying soldiers to France. He did, and the flu kept killing. USS Leviathan. Splash. A body hits the water. Days earlier, armed military police had herded troops onto the Leviathan, sealing them in watertight compartments. It was quarantine, of a sort. If one trooper had the flu, it would only affect the bunkmates sealed in with him. It spread anyway. There is no more room in the sickbay, the mess hall, or any of the other makeshift hospitals. Patients lie on deck in the sun and wind, and bodies only have one place to go. At the rail, a chaplain mutters a prayer. Splash. Another man disappears into the Atlantic. Splash. In 6 weeks, the war will be over. Splash. Tracking the disease from the Surgeon General's office in Washington, D.C., Welch's friend and replacement, Victor Vaughn, expresses alarm at the flu's progress. If this epidemic continues at its mathematical rate of acceleration, he writes, civilization could easily disappear from the face of the earth within a matter of a few more weeks. He, with no concern for politics, rages on. It's good that the mining city of Kimberly is full of excavation equipment, because they'll need it for the graves. 2,500 miners die in the autumn wave, a quarter of the city's working population. By the time the epidemic is over, 9% of Kimberly's citizens are buried in the diamond sheltering earth. The country, the worst hit in Africa, will lose 500,000 people. But another colony will see at least 20 times more death. India. Traditionally, Indians cremate their dead on the riverbank and release their ashes into the Ganges. But there's nothing left to burn. Dead bodies clog the wide river, gathering in clumps. India is no stranger to outbreaks. Just 2 decades before, the country had battled Black Plague. According to recent estimates, between 14 and 20 million Indians died from the flu, the most from any single nation. And yet the flu killed on, affecting each country in its own way. Japan called it sumo disease, since the first outbreak exploded after a public wrestling match. There, the wearing of face masks became so ingrained that it remains a practice today. It possibly killed 4 million on the island of Java alone. It raged through Russia and Mexico, both of which were in the flames of civil war. By 1919, it had penetrated even the most isolated regions. The Wood River, Alaska. Coast Guardsmen step onto the riverbank, calling out to the Yupik village. No one answers. Their ensign hears something moving in one of the earth houses and opens the door to investigate. He slams it and backs away, calling for a rifle. He then smashes in a window and fires into the house again and again and again. He only stops when everything inside no longer moves. Then they douse the village with kerosene and burn it to the ground. For the rest of his life, he will never forget what he saw. 3 enormous sled dogs, starving and feral, fighting over the bones of a dead family. In Fiji, 5% of the population dead. In Tonga, 10%. In Vanuatu, it killed 90% of people in some villages, wiping out 20 unique languages. And then it reached Samoa. The third wave of the pandemic kept years after the pandemic. Researchers initially estimated the disease had killed 20 million people. Modern estimates have increased that number to 50 million. Though because statistics aren't available in the worst hit regions, like India and Russia, the final number may be twice as many. According to modern estimates, it killed 17 to 20 million in India, perhaps 4 million in Indonesia, possibly a million in Russia, 400,000 in France, and 390,000 in Japan. In the United Kingdom, it sickened a quarter of the population and killed up to 220,000. In the US, it took around 675,000, more than the Civil War, and killed 16,000 in Philadelphia alone. But for a disease that killed so many, it's hard to point out direct consequences. In fact, the flu seems to have worked in tandem with the war, each magnifying the effects of the other. In the 1920s, a wave of political unrest swept countries around the globe. This was because of the war, but also because the flu had revealed deep inequalities, especially in colonial rule. Post-viral fatigue from flu infections probably contributed to the depression and listlessness that took hold after the war. Yet, despite the heavy toll the flu took, and the heroism of medical workers that died fighting it, there's still no monument commemorating the event, other than plaques marking mass graves. Textbooks mention it, but usually just in passing. We chose not to remember, which is why some have christened it the Forgotten Plague. But the flu also drove scientific discovery. Doctors developed new surgical techniques and procedures for disease containment. It likely sped up the civilian world's adoption of ambulances. The desperate vaccines produced during the pandemic, cocktails of antibodies from every bacteria doctors suspected, were the predecessor of today's combination vaccines like diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. Nurses, who bore so much of the burden, won new confidence and respect for their profession. Increasingly, their discipline became more than serving as doctors' assistants, and the flu helped them be seen as professionals in their own right. Many cities and nations, caught off guard by the crisis, established new health departments and organizations to monitor disease. It helped push the idea of national health insurance and government-provided medicine. And it drove research. By the 1930s, researchers were crafting effective flu vaccines. And many who battled flu would go on to do great things. Anna Williams nurtured an entire generation of female researchers. FDR eulogized Welch via radio. And remember Oswald Avery, the guy Welch tasked with finding Pfeiffer's bacillus and who helped develop the pneumonia serum? After the war, he returned to researching bacteria, trying to discern how a bacteria without a hard coating transformed into a bacteria with one. After laboring for 20 years, he finally found the substance that caused the change: DNA. That's right. Avery discovered that the purpose of DNA is to carry genetic instructions. Today, he's considered a pioneer of modern genetics. The flu also drove research into Pfeiffer's bacillus, which many still believed caused flu. After working in a military hospital during the war, one Scottish doctor devoted his life to studying microbes. One day, he accidentally left a culture of it out for the night. When he returned the next morning, he found a strange mold growing on it that killed any bacteria it touched. That man was Alexander Fleming. And the mysterious mold? It was penicillin, the first wonder drug and probably the most consequential discovery of the 20th century. Even today, the 1918 flu remains a subject of study for researchers. In fact, over the last several decades, researchers and epidemiologists have started to make breakthroughs on the 1918 flu, helping us better understand what happened so we can combat the next great pandemic. Researchers still don't know where the flu emerged. There are way more theories than we portrayed, but we can now name the culprit. In 1998, researchers obtained a lung sample from a frozen grave in Alaska and confirmed what many suspected. The 1918 flu was H1N1, an avian strain, new then, but is less dangerous now that our immune systems have had a century of exposure. They've also begun to unravel the pandemic's mysteries. For instance, we now suspect that it killed young, healthy people precisely because they were young and healthy. Those patients that turned blue, they probably weren't killed by the flu at all, but by their own immune systems. Once infected, victims' immune systems triggered a massive inflammatory response known as a cytokine storm. But instead of neutralizing the flu, this enormous release of disease-killing cytokines filled the lung sacs with fluid and inflamed them so much they couldn't absorb oxygen. But the greatest lesson of the flu pandemic is that flu can't be ignored. We don't shrug off new flu strains anymore. In fact, many health organizations monitor both human and animal strains, predicting the dominant variety each season and creating vaccine ahead of time. If a new strain does arrive, we'll be much more prepared than doctors were in 1918. We have electron microscopes, antivirals, vaccine labs, and tested containment plans. But a vaccine would still take months to produce, meaning we'd start by using the same measures they did a century ago. Voluntary quarantine, banning public gatherings, staggering work hours. In fact, as Rob researched these episodes, the city where he lives, Hong Kong, closed schools to prevent a seasonal flu outbreak and killed birds that tested positive for avian influenza. A century later, the battle against the 1918 flu and its offspring continues. So seriously, get your flu shot. From an actual medical professional and not a animated cat.